Do you have Artex ceilings in your house that you want to get rid of? Do you want to go from this to this? Yes, in this video we are going to show you how you can plaster over your Artex ceilings to leave them nice, smooth and flat. So if that's something you're interested in, consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing, and enjoy the video. What's up YouTube? So in this video we'll be discussing the subject of how do you plaster over Artex ceilings. Yes, in the United Kingdom, for some bizarre reason, we thought it a few years ago that having Artex ceilings was something truly fantastic. Well, in 2021 that would not be the case anymore. As such, we get asked all the time as plasterers to get rid of Artex. So in this video we're going to show you how we go about the process of turning Artex ceilings into nice, smooth, flat ceilings. So when it comes to plastering over Artex ceilings, there are a few things that are important to remember, not only for a homeowner but also as a professional. And the first thing and the most important thing is that British Gypsum that make the plaster do not recommend plastering straight over Artex. It can be done at the end of the day if the Artex is stable. There is no problem here. We've been doing it for years. We very rarely ever have a problem, and usually when we do have a problem it isn't because of the plaster itself, but rather things like distemper or lining paper, etc. So remember, there isn't any guarantee when it comes to plastering onto Artex. The second thing to remember is to do the checks properly beforehand. So you need to make sure that there is no lining paper underneath the Artex. The easiest way to check this is to undo the rosettes of the lighting and just check to see if there is any paper there. It's usually the easiest way to tell. The other thing to remember is, certainly in the United Kingdom, if the house that you were plastering in was built around the 1925 to 1930s, there is a very good chance that it will suffer with something called distemper. If that happens, so basically distemper is like a chalky type of paint, plaster won't stick to it. When you plaster over it, what will happen is that the plaster will fall off. So if that happens, it has to be overboarded. So if the house is around 1930s, steer clear from plastering over the Artex directly. There's a good chance you'll have problems. But if you're really not sure, recommend an overboard. But other than that, I should say that there's one more thing actually, and this is just a recommendation for us. Some Artex contains asbestos. Admittedly, the percentage of asbestos is very small. As such, we as plasterers, we as a company, we do not recommend in any way that you scrape the Artex first. So in this one here, fortunately we're quite lucky in that it's quite a shallow Artex, but even if it wasn't so shallow, we would not be scraping this. If it's so bad that you have to scrape it, so namely the ridges are over 5 mil, then we would recommend an overboard on the grounds that if it has Artex in it, unless they've had it checked, which some homeowners do but some don't, but if there's a chance it has Artex in it, consider overboarding. But we never scrape the Artex. It's certainly something that we wouldn't recommend. The things that we've actually mentioned here, we actually mention them in the quotes that we provide, so that they're aware of the risk, but also if a problem does occur, that the way to fix it is actually to overboard it, and it gives the homeowner the option as to whether they want to spend the extra money on getting it overboarded. But for this ceiling here, it looks pretty sound. There's nothing to suggest there'll be any issues with this, so we're going to crack on with it. So the first thing to do when it comes to preparing your ceiling for Artex is to control the suction. Now there are several ways to do this, and depending on the type of Artex that you have, you may choose to use different methods to control the suction. So the most common is to use PVA glue. So a bit of watered down PVA glue, 1 or 2 coats over it, that will be fine. That's the method we're going to use here. The other alternative is to use a stabilizer like blue grit or green grit. That's fine. Generally we don't usually do that because the point of blue grit is to kill suction and give grip. Well, by the very nature of Artex, it has grip anyway, so you're only looking to kill the suction, so it's not massively necessary. The third alternative, and we very rarely ever use this, is to use SBR. The reason why we don't use it is because if you get SBR flicking down the walls in somebody's house, it's really difficult to get rid of. So we generally recommend that as a last resort. The only time you'd ever consider that is if it's neat Artex that hasn't been painted. That will pull in very fast. But generally, if the Artex has been painted, there's no reason to use SBR. We also don't tend to use blue grit or green grit so much. 1, because it's more expensive. 2, it's more time consuming. 3, you don't need the grip. And 4, it's a lot messier if you drop it on the walls when you're rollering it and you're not actually plastering the wall, so it's more cleaning up. So for us, we always recommend PVA. So what I'm now going to do is I'm just going to time lapse us running the PVA with the roller. You'll also notice in the camera shot that we have dropped down the rosettes from the light bars, and we'll just brush around those. What we're going to do is we're going to crack on with rolling that now. Okay, so when it comes to mixing up the plaster for Artex, one of the things that we quite like to do is we put a few handfuls of hardwall or bonding in with the first coat. So this here, it's 7 meters long, 3 meters wide. So what we're going to do is we're going to mix up just under 2 bags of multi-finish, and then probably put in 4 or 5 handfuls of hardwall. What's the reason for this? Well, it's quite a large Artex ceiling as far as they go. I'm on my own. Louis not here today. So the hardwall will give me a little bit longer time to apply the plaster. It will also stay wet for a lot longer. So if you're concerned about being able to cover the meterage in time, put some hardwall in with the mix. Doesn't need to be an awful lot. The other thing that it does, it makes the plaster go an awful lot further, and it also gives the plaster volume, so it covers over the dimples in the Artex an awful lot easier. So top tip, put a little bit of hardwall, so it doesn't have to be a lot, 4 or 5 handfuls in with the mix. It'll make all the difference. You will have some that say that you shouldn't do this, etc. so forth. The reality is it makes absolutely no difference whatsoever to the quality of the finish at the end. It just makes your life easier. So it's a brilliant tip for, you know, giving yourself a little bit more time and covering over the Artex much easier. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to mix that up. We'll catch up when I'm applying the plaster. You want your trowel to be pretty flat. What you'll probably find is, especially if you've got very aggressive Artex, what you're probably going to find is that it might struggle to cover the Artex on the first coat. It's not a big deal if you just make sure that trowel is pretty much sliding over the top of the Artex, so it's at least filling in all the low spots, and they'll make it an awful lot easier on the second coat. But what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to crash around and apply this plaster to the ceiling. So going nice long strokes. Just another thing to consider as well, it's good practice on a ceiling, especially when you're doing Artex, because you tend to have a little bit more on the trowel when applying over Artex. It's wise to have safety goggles on. Plaster in your eye is no joke. It'll ruin the rest of your day, so it is good practice not to do as I do, but rather as I say, and consider wearing safety glasses so as not to have a trip down to A&E. Okay, so this ceiling has had its first coat of plaster on. Amazingly, probably more luck than judgment, there is just the right amount of plaster, which is always nice, especially on a large ceiling. What we're now going to do is we're going to flatten it with a speed skim spatula, as we've mentioned. As we've mentioned plenty of times before, the one that we're going to use is this Refina one here, but the reality is any would be fine. Now, because this room is so long, it's very obvious that the joists are going this way. What you find with a ceiling that is this long, that quite often it can have waves where over time the boards start to sag. So what we're actually going to do is, for the first coat, we're just going to use the spatula going in this direction, so going with those joists, just to take out some of those undulations. If you don't have a spatula or a speed skim, it's not a big deal. All you're going to want to do is just let the plaster pull right in. If you're not sure on this, go back to our video on timing, and that will give you an idea as to what you're looking for in the plaster to be able to flatten it properly. Okay, so what I have now done is run the spatula over the ceiling. Unfortunately, the homeowner's dogs decided to run down the stairs and cause absolute havoc, so needless to say, that footage is completely useless. Now, there is something very important to remember when you're doing a second coat. So firstly, if you end up putting hardwall in the first coat, it's very important that you clean the bucket out before the second mix, because the last thing you want is hardwall or bonding aggregate in the top coat. That's not what you want. The second thing to remember is that generally, when you're just using something like multi-finish, the second coat is usually about half the first coat. This is not the case when it comes to when you're adding hardwall. It increases the volume massively. I have no idea why, it just does. So for here, this was a bag and 3/4 and about 5 or 6 handfuls of hardwall. So I will do a bag and 3/4 of multi-finish on the second coat to cover the rest of this. In fact, I might even do 2 because it is a fraction low over there. But if you're doing this method, you just need to remember that what you put on in the first coat, it will be the same as the second coat. There was nothing left over at all. So that's what I'll be doing on the second coat. The last thing to remember, very, very important, you do not want the hardwall coming through on the top coat, so you have to let this go right off, a lot more than you would if it was multi-finish. But obviously you're not waiting till it's bone dry, but it needs to be where that there's no chance that you're going to pull any of that hardwall through on that first coat. So let it pull right in. And you can see, possibly, if I tip the camera up, it is still very, very wet. It took me about 15 minutes or so, 15-20 minutes to put the ceiling on and flatten it. And it hasn't skinned over at all. It's still very, very wet. That is the nice thing about adding hardwall. You have an awful long time. Don't get me wrong, 7 meters by 3 meters. It's not the world's largest ceiling by any means, but it's certainly big enough for Artex. But it's just given me plenty of time. I can sit down, have a drink, have a sandwich, etc., so forth, before I start mixing up again. But I've already cleaned out the bucket. I'm going to start filling up water for the next mix, get everything ready so that I can just get cracking whenever that ceiling is pulled in. So we're going to catch up when I'm applying the second coat. Okay, so we have left this to pull in for about 20 minutes, almost maybe even half an hour. If I was to show you now, this is the consistency of it. So it's pulled right in, but there's still a little bit of moisture. There's still a little bit of moisture in the ceiling. So I have knocked up the gear a little bit stiffer, to be honest with you. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to start on that far side where the Artex was a little bit more aggressive. So what I can do is, if I've got any left over, I can just go over that again once I've gone all the way around the ceiling. And as mentioned already, I've mixed up about 2 bags of plaster. That should be enough to be able to put a generous coat, second coat over the top. So what I'm going to do is just put that on time lapse so you can see me applying the plaster to the wall. This time we will be going right up to the coving. You'll notice that none of the coving that is up got any plaster on it, obviously because I stayed away by about 1 inch or so. So it was one less thing that I had to do, so I didn't have to clean it up. Makes a big difference, especially if the set's getting away from you a little bit. Anything you can do to save yourself a little bit of time is a win in my book. So on the second coat we'll be going straight up to that coving and filling that out. So I'll put that on time lapse and we'll catch up once it's all on. Okay, so we have now applied the second coat of plaster. What I did, I flattened it down straight away with the speed skim or the spatula. Same as every other time that we flatten down ceilings, it all looks about the same. Again, just to reiterate the point, if you don't have a speed skim or a spatula, it's not a big deal. You just need to let the plaster just pull in a little bit before you flatten it down with your trowel. But this is how it's currently looking if I take it off the tripod. So I have applied the plaster pretty thick. This was the area that was showing a lot of Artex, and it's all pretty much gone. There is 2 bits just there. What I'm actually going to do is I'm actually just going to use the edge of my trowel and just dig out those high spots with a trowel rather than me just trying to go over the top of it, filling it in with plaster. So I'll do that in a second. What I've done, again, because it's the plaster's on fairly thick, it's dragged a little bit, which is why it looks a touch tigery in the middle there, just because of how thick it is. But what I'll actually do is I'm going to let that pull in for 5 or 10 minutes, and I'm actually going to spat that again, and then we'll start getting a really nice finish. You shouldn't get that look if you are flattening with a trowel and you just leave it some time. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave this for a bit, clean up everything, get rid of the old plaster, clean up, put away the tools that I don't need anymore, and then we will catch up when I'm flattening in the plaster. So we'll catch up at that point. So we are now at the point where we need to start flattening this ceiling. And the trowel I'm actually going to use is this one here. It is the Refina Superflex 3. Don't worry if you don't have a Superflex trowel. Just a normal standard laying on trowel would be better, and possibly even preferential. I'm only really using this, one, because I have it, and 2, it makes it a little bit easier just for cleaning up against the coving. Now, I have already run the trowel along this side of the ceiling, and I'm just going to come across just where the sofas are here, troweling back into the middle. Now, the point that we are at, the ceiling has been allowed to pull in a bit, and it's got that slimy texture towards it. What I'm going to do is just going to close that plaster in a little bit, fill in some of the misses, but also tidy up some of the coving. Now, if I was to take you very carefully off the tripod. Now, when it comes to cleaning the coving, common sense might suggest that it would be wise just to brush with a wet brush and clean that up. We do not recommend cleaning the coving at this time, and the reason being is because the plaster is still wet. When you then apply the wet brush to the coving to clean it off, you end up smearing plaster all over the coving. So it's actually far better to do your best to keep it as clean as you can using the trowel, but then wipe it down right towards the end. That way you're not smearing wet plaster all over it. But the way we like to get a good finish against the coving, you can see it's a little bit rough, is just to use the corner of your trowel like so, and then just drag it along like so. So just really squeeze that in, like so. And then use your trowel and then just push it into the corner. You can see there's a little bit of plaster here. Do your best, just see if you can just push it in to the corner. Almost like you're trying to just slightly scrape it off that edge profile. And it just means that you're able to just keep it a little bit cleaner without adding any water to the coving, making it a bit messy. So it makes a big difference if you can try and fill those holes in at this stage rather than later on filling it in with fat. You'll get a much nicer, much more professional looking finish. I say, don't worry too much if you don't have a flexible trowel. It isn't the end of the world. It just makes your life easier if you happen to have one. But like most things, the stiffer the trowel, or the stiffer the flexible trowel you have, the easier it is. Obviously, Superflex 3, I believe, I'm right in thinking it happens to be the stiffest flexible trowel on the market currently. So very flat angle, a little hole there, another one there, just fill these in. Best you can. Okay, so we are now going to the point where we are going to start applying the wet trowel on the ceiling. So it's exactly the same principle as any other set that you do. Use that technique of apply the water with a brush, and as you wipe over the plaster, if it's not leaving scratch marks, you are good to go. So that's the stage we're at on this ceiling, so we're going to start wet troweling now. It's the same as any other wet trowel that you do. Nice firm pressure. Reasonable angle. And apply the water where you put the trowel. The trowel I'm using is my 14-inch carbon steel, my original carbon steel. No other reason than I fancy an easy life, to be honest with you. I want to go home, so I'm going to use the better trowel. What I'll do on this one is use the carbon steel for this trowel, and then I'll probably switch back to the Refina Superflex 3 for the second wet trowel. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run around the whole ceiling doing the wet trowel, the same as every other wet trowel that you would do on a plastering set. Okay, so the final pass to do on this ceiling, what I've done is I did a wet trowel with the carbon, and I've just done a second wet trowel with the Refina Superflex 3. And all I'm going to do is a very quick dry pass with a plastic trowel. This is the Nela plastic trowel, but any will do. And it's just be a quick lick over the whole ceiling just to close it all in. So that really is the final pass. It's a very quick trowel. And so you're not looking to put any water on at this point. Just a very quick run over with the trowel. Just to give that nice glossy finish. So this is how it came out. Nice. Smooth and flat. No sign of Artex anywhere. So that is it. I've just run the final plastic trowel. Probably took me no more than 3 or 4 minutes just to run a quick pass over it, and this is how it came out. Looks lovely. No sign that there was Artex ever there, which is obviously what the customer wanted. So that's just a very quick step-by-step guide on how you can get rid of your Artex in your house to leave a professional finish so that nobody ever knew there was Artex there in the first place. We hope you enjoyed the video. Consider giving a thumbs up and subscribing, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks again.